So I would like to welcome everyone to the 2022 Pufendorf lectures. I'm Erik J. Olsson, Professor of Theoretical Philosophy here at Lund University. And it's a great pleasure to welcome in particular Professor Amie L. Thomasson as this year's Pufendorf lecturer. She's the Daniel P. Stone Professor of Intellectual and Moral Philosophy at the Dartmouth College in the USA. Before coming to Dartmouth, she was Professor of Philosophy and Cooper Fellow at the University of Miami, and she has also held positions at the University of Hong Kong and Texas Tech University. Professor Thomasson works in the areas of metaphysics, philosophical methodology, and meta-ontology, philosophy of art, philosophy of social and cultural objects, philosophy of mind, and phenomenology. Her current work focuses on questions about what philosophy can legitimately do and how we can do it. She's the author of many books, namely 4 books: Norms and Necessity from 2020, Ontology Made Easy, 2015, Ordinary Objects, 2007, and Fiction and Metaphysics, which came out in 1999. She also co-edited a collection of essays entitled Phenomenology and Philosophy of Mind. So almost all of these books came out on Oxford University Press. The exception is Fiction and Metaphysics, which came out on Cambridge University Press. Her book, Ontology Made Easy, was awarded the American Philosophical Association's 2017 Sanders Book Prize. In addition to her books, she has published more than 80 book chapters and articles on topics in her areas of expertise. Professor Thomasson has held fellowships with the National Endowment for the Humanities, and she has recently been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for this academic year of 2022-2023. And to this collection, she can now add the 2022 Pufendorf Medal. She delivered the 2017 Wahlberg lectures at the University of Stockholm in Sweden, and also the 2021 Whitehead lectures at Harvard University. And in this year of 2022, she will present, besides the Pufendorf lectures, the Anna Tomarkin lectures in Bern in Switzerland. In July to August 2018, she was the Anderson Distinguished Fellow at the University of Sydney in Australia. And she has also been a visitor at the Australian National University and at Durham University in the UK. So in her Pufendorf lectures, Professor Thomasson will address 2 approaches that, in her view, have dominated work in metaphysics since its post-positivist revival. So one is an explanatory approach, and the other is a truth-maker approach. Both rely, she will argue, on the problematic assumption that has taken metaphysics in what she believes to be the wrong direction, leading to pseudo-problems and epistemological mysteries. The result is, she believes, a metaphysics in crisis. On a more positive note, she also aims to show that by eliminating the assumption in question, we can disentangle ourselves from all problems and hopefully see more fruitful directions for metaphysics. So again, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and we look forward very much to your lectures. So the stage is yours, please.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thanks to the whole philosophy department for organizing these lectures and for having me here. I am so honored to be the Pufendorf lecturer this year and delighted to be here with you all. And thanks also just for taking time out to come here on such a beautiful day. So the big scale topic you can see me as aiming to speak about over the next 3 days is roughly this, put in its simplest form. What should we do with metaphysics? Right. Of course, in some ways we can speak of it as a historical tradition with which we're all familiar, working back to work of Aristotle's on categories, Descartes on mind and body, Locke's work on persons, Hume on liberty and necessity, and endless other exemplary instances. But again, as we know, it was widely rejected in the early 20th century. It was treated as nonsense by the positivists, used only as a term of derision, right, to be doing metaphysics. And it was certainly avoided by both philosophers working in the ordinary language philosophy tradition and the phenomenological tradition. back. Right? And by the time I was in graduate school, it was very much back in the later 20th century. Where, again, as I will argue, I think there's been two sort of dominant conceptions of metaphysics that have played a central role in its revival. They're related in ways we'll talk about. A sort of explanatory conception and a truth-maker conception. The question at this juncture is, what should we do now with metaphysics? And in answering this question, one of the sort of guiding ideas that I'll be coming back to over these 3 days is the idea that language serves many functions. Of course, in some ways, it takes no great work in philosophy or linguistics to notice that language serves many functions. We order coffee, we praise our children, we set rules for our students, we share information, and many, many more things besides. But while it's an obvious observation, it's one that's often been forgotten, I think, especially in metaphysics. And one thing I will be arguing is that failing to notice or to take seriously the functional pluralism in language has often led metaphysics into puzzles, paradoxes, pseudo-problems, and irrelevant and necessary debates, which have, I would say, left metaphysics in a crisis. I'll also try to argue that appreciating the kind of functional pluralism in language and developing the idea as clearly as we can that language serves many functions can bring us in fruitful new directions and help disentangle us from many old metaphysical problems. So this series of lectures will have both a sort of negative point and a positive point. Negatively, I'll argue that the two prominent approaches to metaphysics rely on a kind of functional monist assumption. Of course, there's other approaches one might take and that some have taken to metaphysics. We can always discuss those in the Q&A, but you have to focus somewhere, and these have certainly been central. What I'll argue is that the criteria employed in both the explanatory conception and the truth-maker conception of metaphysics and the demands they impose really only make sense as long as you fail to notice a kind of functional pluralism about language. And that failing to notice them, as I said, has led us into a range of pseudo-problems, epistemological mysteries, and crisis. Positively, and this will be mostly in Lecture 3, though you'll catch the scent of it earlier, I want to try to give a direction in which we can reconceive of the work of metaphysics in ways that may lead us into more fruitful and doable and less mysterious directions. This will involve both a discussion of how we can really try to make good on and make more precise and detailed the idea that language serves many functions and how we can identify linguistic functions, and also what difference that will make to our philosophical work in both dissolving old problems and showing us ways to make progress on these sort of reinterpreted new problems. Okay, so the two dominant approaches to metaphysics that I will discuss, the explanatory conception today, the truth-maker conception tomorrow, and then on Friday I'll discuss a sort of positive vision of how we can reconceive of metaphysics roughly as a kind of conceptual engineering. On the explanatory conception, right, the tendency is to think of metaphysics as along the same lines as, or maybe as part of doing a same total project with the natural sciences, and as in the business fundamentally of explanation, right? The truth-maker conception isn't as focused on explanation, at least not in a kind of causal sense of explanation like we think of the natural sciences as, but rather seeing the goal as trying to say what really exists or what's fundamental, right? And you see this in different forms, perhaps most famously with Armstrong's work, who was, I guess, a predecessor here. And it focuses on the question, what features of the world is it that make our claims true? So let's focus for today then on the explanatory conception. So the explanatory conception, I think, is a general, widely shared conception of metaphysics across a range of metaphysicians who typically trace the idea to Quine. Now, this is not Quine interpretation, and to some extent, I think, in some ways in which it's developed and used, this explanatory conception is not entirely Quinean, Right? It tends to miss the kind of pragmatist side of Quine. So I do not mean to attribute this all to the historical Quine. I intend to say he's kind of the inspiration for the way a lot of other metaphysicians have taken this view of what metaphysics can do. And when it's traced to Quine, again, it's usually with a fairly limited temporal part of Quine in mind, right? The Quine of On What There Is, which of course is sort of most metaphysicians' standard starting place in their courses or work, and is widely hailed as bringing ontology back, right? After the positivist doubts, after it had seemed to have sort of defeated Carnap, right, as the story goes. As Putnam famously puts it, with the article On What There Is, Quine single-handedly made ontology a respectable subject. Right? Now, ontology, obviously, is only one part of metaphysics broadly, usually thought of as the part concerned with existence questions. What is there, or what exists, if you prefer, right? So what conception of metaphysics do people draw out of On What There Is, right? Well, they draw out of it this kind of, I mean, you could call this same explanatory view of metaphysics roughly the kind of scientistic view, right? That metaphysics is either like or of a piece with science, and you can develop these in slightly different ways. Here's Quine's famous words. Our acceptance of an ontology is, I think, similar in principle to our acceptance of a scientific theory, say a system of physics. We adopt, at least insofar as we're reasonable, the simplest conceptual scheme into which the disordered fragments of raw experience can be fitted and arranged. Our ontology is determined once we have fixed upon the overall conceptual scheme, which is to accommodate science in the broadest sense. Now you can isolate, I think, two different forms of an explanatory conception of metaphysics, or perhaps you want to say an explanatory approach to existence questions, or what is their questions. There's a kind of local form, right, where we ask whether or not the alleged entities, properties, beliefs, social groups, fictional characters, numbers, whatever, right, would add explanatory power as a central criterion in determining whether to accept them, right? So here we ask of the P's, the numbers or the properties or whatever, does positing them add explanatory power to our theories? If not, there's at least a prima facie suspicion against them, right? Sometimes these are thought of as, I think most generally as explaining facts. What explains the fact that the red house and the red barn have something in common? Right? Sometimes it's thought of as explaining norms. What explains why we oughtn't to kill, right? Is it a moral property or a moral fact out there? Then there's also this sort of, I think, somewhat more sophisticated, holistic form of an explanatory conception, and that's much closer to the historical Quine's settled views on the matter, right? That says, look, the approach is a little more subtle than that. It's not just ask whether the P's contribute explanatory power in order to determine whether we should posit the P's, but let's go holistic. Let's ask what total explanatory theory we should accept, and then we should accept the existence of all and only those entities over which we must quantify in order to render it true, right? And of course, that's familiar as Quine's criterion of ontological commitment. I'm going to look at both of these conceptions in turn, right? So we'll start looking at the local form. Even though it's not exactly Quine's settled view, he makes appeals of this sort in discussing both properties and meanings in On What There Is. And it's been hugely influential, right? So you see this in a million metaphysics articles, right? On entities from, as I say, fictional characters to social groups to numbers. Do they add explanatory power? And if the answer is yes, this is taken as grounds for saying there are such things. If the answer is no, it's taken as grounds for denying them, right? So hugely influential. Why do people like the explanatory approach? Well, I think it's not hard to see why it's appealing to many metaphysicians, especially after being dismissed in the first half of the 20th century, right, in favor of the sciences, right, as the positivists were wont to do. It seems to lend a kind of scientific respectability to metaphysics. And many metaphysicians of my generation really emphasize this. People like Ted Sider, Laurie Paul, and so on, right? Look, there's no special epistemological problems for metaphysics, they like to say. It's just like the sciences, right? We have the same criteria for positing properties and numbers as we do, as scientists do for positing microbes, planets, or a new kind of particle. Namely, are they going to add explanatory power to our theory? Right. So you get this claim that falls out of it that there's no special epistemological problems for metaphysics, and that metaphysical views are confirmed either just in the same way that scientific theories are, right? Usually by the appeal here is to our kind of inference to the best explanation, right? Or with, as part of our scientific theories, which are confirmed sort of wholesale. This is more like the approach that Ted Sider takes. All right, so that's the goal, right? And this is when I press, as I've been doing for a while now, epistemological worries about the way metaphysics is conducted and how we could possibly come to know which of warring metaphysical theories is true, right? This is the standard response. It's just like the sciences, it's just inference to the best explanation, same kinds of criteria, no problem. Well, I think that's a little quick, right? I think this kind of response still leaves us with a lot of epistemological mystery and obscurity, right? And this has been brought out in a lot of the recent literature. So, right, in appealing to a kind of inference to the best explanation, what makes it best is generally thought to be appeal to the theoretic virtues. Now, in the case of metaphysical theories, unlike most scientific theories, right, this has to be theoretical virtues other than empirical adequacy, because everybody recognizes there's no empirical differences among the leading contenders in most metaphysical debates about, do we have properties as universals or only as tropes, or do we accept only a world of states of affairs, or, right, what do we do? Everyone admits there's no empirical difference among them. So it's got to be these other theoretical virtues, right? Ideological and ontological simplicity, explanatory power, and so on, right? But then, of course, there's a lot of doubts that have been raised, well-grounded doubts, about whether these theoretic virtues, especially other than empirical adequacy, are truth-conducive, even in the sciences, right? Or do they just make theories easier for limited creatures like us to use if they're simpler, right? I really like, for example, Ottavio Bueno and Scott Szalkowski's work on this. Then there's additional worries about whether, even if the theoretic virtues other than empirical adequacy are truth-conducive in the sciences, if this would carry over to metaphysics, right? And here there's different kinds of worries because we don't have the same kinds of evidential basis for our metaphysical theories, and we don't have empirical adequacy in the mix at all. Scott Szalkowski and Juha Saatsi have both done some really nice work trying to show that even if the theoretic virtues are truth-conducive in the sciences, we can't expect that to carry over in metaphysics. I won't repeat that work here. There's also been work done, including by metaphysicians, who are certainly more serious about metaphysics than I am anyway, showing in some detail that in a lot of central cases of metaphysical debates, where those debates are conducted by trying to weigh up the theoretical virtues, right, quite typically we end up with a stalemate, where you just trade off one theoretic virtue for another. One might win on ontological simplicity but lose on ideological, and the other vice versa, right? And Uriah Kriegel and Karen Bennett each go through a number of cases showing how this happens. This was kind of the story of the life of Armstrong, too, I think, who, in a beautifully honest way, will end up trying to show the kind of balance of virtues between, say, his approach and David Lewis's approach on a subject, right? Or his approach and Keith Campbell's approach on properties. All right, so that's all work that's been done elsewhere, just to remind us of the difficulties of a kind of epistemology for metaphysics if you take the explanationist approach. Right? I'm not going to try to push that point here today. As I say, others have done that. And I'm not going to try to show you that that approach is completely wrong or leads to insuperable difficulties. What I want to do instead is to try to give you more of a diagnosis of where it's gone wrong and why it might lead us astray. So the questions I'll be presenting are this. Is addition of explanatory power a legitimate criterion for accepting or rejecting entities in ontology, even if we hold tight and assume that it is relevant for accepting or rejecting entities in the natural sciences, accepting planets or particles or microbes? That would be a question for the local form of the explanatory conception that says only posit P's if P's add explanatory power. Is this a legit criterion? It's used a lot. 2, is it legitimate to think of the project of ontology as an explanatory project in which we aim to say what there is by asking what we must posit in our best explanatory theory? And that would be a question presented to the holistic form of the explanatory approach. Okay, so let's start with the local approach, which would take a central criterion for whether we should accept that there are P's. Do P's add explanatory power? Again, this is inspired by Quine, especially a couple of passages in on what there is, and then it's used all over the place. So the discussion in Quine, as probably everybody remembers, is in his criticisms of the imaginary opponent, McX. Right? So McX says, according to Quine, obviously it's just a fictional character, ontological statements follow immediately from all manner of casual statements of commonplace fact. So, for example, there is an attribute follows from there are red houses, red roses, and red sunsets. Going back to this after a number of years away, I was somewhat surprised to find that, McX is an easy ontologist. Right? Fictional character, but kind of like me. All right. Sidebar. So Quine, for example, says, in response to this, that was McX, in response to McX, Quine says, that the houses and roses and sunsets, or all of them red, may be taken as ultimate and irreducible. And it may be held that McX is no better off, in point of real explanatory power, for all the occult entities which he posits under such names as redness. Right? It's worth noting the language here, too, right? So he claims that McX is no better off in terms of explanatory power, uses that as grounds for rejecting property talk, right, rejecting properties, he would say. Claims that then if we posit them, we're thinking of it as a quasi-scientific posit here, the word posit's not accidental, then it's like positing something occult, right, like ghosts or something. Similarly, a few pages later, Quine makes the same sort of move about meaning talk, right? He says, while we may speak of utterances as significant or insignificant, synonymous or heteronymous, the explanatory value of special and irreducible intermediary entities called meanings is surely illusory. Again, using this as a way of casting suspicion on the idea that we should say there are such things as meanings or properties. And this has led to the standard form of argument, appeal to the explanatory power gained or not, to argue for or against positing the entities. Right? This is also closely related to the Eleatic criterion of existence, right? Assuming that we think of explanation here, the gain of explanatory power, in the form of causal explanation, right, such as you get in the sciences, which seems to be what's meant by it. And if that's the case, then if you don't have causal powers, you can't be a causal explainer, and the Eleatic criterion is going to tell you to eliminate pretty much the same entities as the explanatory power criterion. Okay, so I'm going to argue that this is an inappropriate criterion. Here's a route, the sort of dialectical route I'll be taking. First, I want to ask why one might, with Quine, doubt that properties and meanings lack explanatory power. Quine doesn't really, at least not in this article, say why, right? He sort of points it out as kind of obvious, right, and uses it to reject them. I'm going to actually say I think Quine's right about this, that properties and meanings can't add explanatory power to McX's theory, if you want to call it that. Right? But then this is going to lead us to a certain observation about property talk and meaning talk and many other forms of talk. Right? Namely, it's going to lead us to a discovery about how this discourse functions, what we want it for, what it's there for. And this will lead us into one of those functional pluralist ideas I alluded to at the beginning. Right? In ways that will ultimately, I'll argue, suggest that the contribution of explanatory power is an inappropriate criterion, at least taken as an across-the-board criterion for accepting any entities whatsoever, including many of those that are really at issue in metaphysical debates. All right, that's where we're going. So first, why might you, with Quine, think that properties and meanings don't add explanatory power to McX's theory, right? So if you're thinking like McX is, and let's just think with McX for a minute here. Well, think about the contrast case, right? So sometimes it does seem like a pretty good criterion, right? When are we justified in positing entities as explainers? Well, we do it in daily life, and we do it in the natural sciences in ways that seem to make sense, right? So, I don't know if this has happened to any of you as it has to me. You may notice that there are holes in some packets of food in your pantry, the food spilled on the floor. You may notice teeny tiny little feces on the floor. You may hear scuffling in the night. Ordinary life. You may then posit that you have mice as the best explanation of all of these effects. So that seems like a pretty good inference to the best explanation kind of argument. Cool. Doctors do this all the time, right? They'll observe a number of symptoms, a cluster of symptoms in their patient, and posit that maybe you have a certain kind of virus or bacterium that's causing the illness, right? And then hopefully do some further investigations to treat it, but they will hypothesize it as the best explanation of the observed symptoms. Famously, Leverrier and Adams, right, both looked at some strange effects in the orbit of Uranus and posited that there must be this other planet out there that was causing these perturbations in the orbit of Uranus, and Neptune, of course, was later confirmed. All these look pretty good. So sometimes, I don't mean to deny that we're sometimes justified in positing entities as explainers in ordinary life and in the natural sciences. And these are all causal explainers, right? So the relevant sense of explanation that seems to justify us in posits is a causal sense. All right, now let's go back to McX, right? So McX, as a good easy ontologist, a proto-easy ontologist, held that there is an attribute follows trivially from there are red houses, red roses, and red sunsets, right? So this is the same kind of move we get in easy ontology, right? You can start from an uncontested initial claim like the barn is red and move by what looks like a sort of free or trivial inference to say the barn has the property of redness, right? Or similarly, you can move from an uncontested claim like dog is intertranslatable with the German term Hund to say dog has the same meaning as Hund. And then you can go on from either of these to say, so there is something that the barn has, the property of redness, there is a property. There is some meaning that dog and Hund share, right? And so on. All right. If that's the way you're thinking about it, then I think it doesn't take too much to show that these entities, the meanings and the properties, can't add explanatory power for McX, right? Why? Well, I don't think we have to get into all sorts of deep discussions about what explanation is to agree on this much. Whatever they are, normative virtue explanations aren't real explanations, right? So many of you will remember the famous line from the Molière play, the old joke, right? You go to the learned doctor and you say, "Why do poppies make us sleepy, doctor?" And the doctor says, "Oh, it is because they have the dormitive virtue." Right? Well, there's no prior use of this term. It's not that identifies some chemical kind. It's just a fancy way of saying, because they make us sleepy. They have something in them that makes us sleepy, right? So this is just a fancy way of restating that poppies make us sleepy, and that's why it's a joke, right? It doesn't really tell us anything. It doesn't explain anything. It has only the appearance of an explanation. But it's just restating in sort of noun term, poppies make us sleepy, fancy Latin noun term, right? Like Latin-based, that they have a dormitive virtue. To give the illusion of an explanation in what's really a restatement in a different grammatical form. Yeah. All right, now let's look back at these alleged ontological explanations that we might hope to get out of property talk or meaning talk, right? So you ask, why is the barn red? If your answer is because there's a property of redness possessed by the barn, right? This has exactly the same form as a dormitive virtue explanation, right? We're just shifting the grammatical form here, but it can't really be anything like a causal explanation, certainly, of anything, right? In fact, it doesn't seem to give any kind of anything that really counts as explanation. Why is dog translatable as Hund? Because dog and Hund have the same meaning similarly, right? So if you're an easy ontologist about these things, pretty clearly the best you can get out of them is dormitive virtue explanations, which is no real explanation at all. And then we can see why maybe Quine had this intuition that they can't add explanatory power to McX's so-called theory. Okay, so the lesson so far is if we take reference to the P's, whatever they are, to be derived by redundant or trivial inferences from non-controversial claims, then the P's can't be invoked, at least not to explain those claims, right? It's just a grammatical restatement of it in a different grammatical form. It's not an explanation. Okay, so I'm going to agree with Quine that far, but I'm still going to ask, was this a good criterion to begin with? Maybe they don't. Maybe the meanings and the properties don't contribute explanatory power to McX's theory, but was that a good criterion? Now, some of you might be sitting there saying, yeah, okay, if you go along with McX on easy ontology, but I don't want to go to easy ontology. Well, I won't have time, even with you so generously allowing me 3 lectures, to argue for easy ontology here. I've tried to do that at length elsewhere in my 2015 book. The easy ontological tradition is suggested already way back in work by Frege. Introduces this sort of easy inferences to directions, right? If lines A and B are parallel, then we can introduce a term for the direction of A and B, right? It's implicit in some of Husserl's work in the logical investigations also, which I'll come to later a little bit. Then in recent literature, taken up in a close form, it's not exactly the same as mine, by Bob Hale and Crispin Wright in their work on numbers. Stephen Schiffer broadens it out to also give sort of easy ontological inferences. That's my term, not his. He calls them pleonastic inferences because they're redundant. For properties, propositions is what he cares most about, meanings, fictional characters, and so on. And then I argue for broadening it even much further, these kinds of easy inferences in Ontology Made Easy. So there's lots of things to worry about this. I tried to handle most of the objections there. If anybody cares, we can talk about it in the Q&A. I will at least give you a few sort of quick reminders of what evidence there is that these really are acceptable, easy, trivial inferences that entitle us to come to say things about properties, meanings, propositions, numbers, etc., right? One of them is from Schiffer, right? The sort of felt redundancy in saying things like, the house is red and the house has the property of redness, right? Sounds redundant to a normal speaker who's not spent years in the metaphysics room, right? And this is, of course, what Schiffer emphasizes. You can also appeal to standard epistemic norms, right? So you don't ask anybody to do any further investigation to move from a claim that the house is red to entitle them to assert that the house has the property of redness. You don't say, well, go back again and check, right? Whereas in other claims, even if they're obvious, right, and quite likely to be true, we do require further investigation, say to move from the house is red to the house has a door, even if it's pretty obvious that a house is going to have a door, right? The second doesn't follow from the first. We need more investigation. We can appeal to our different reactions that we'd have. This is sort of borrowing from the Strauss and Geach, in Defense of a Dogma paper, right? We'd have to someone who said, the house is red, and it's not the case that the house has the property of redness. Again, if they're not a metaphysician anyway, we would have no idea even what to make of them, right? We'd be bewildered. What are they trying to say? Do they not understand their terms? What's going on? They sound like they're contradicting themselves. Versus someone who would say the house is red, and it's not the case that the house has a door. Also surprising, right? But now we just go check the door, check for a door, not be bewildered at how to even understand what they're saying. We can also look at the different responses we'd have to inferences, right? So it seems to make sense to say the house is red, so the house has a property of redness, right? That makes sense. But the house is red, so the house has a chimney, non sequitur, right? We can also appeal to the differences in appropriateness, right? In whether we can insert probably, right? So the house is red, so the house probably has the property of redness. Again, hard to even see how to make any sense of this, right? Whereas other claims that are merely quite likely empirical claims, like the house is in Vermont, so the house probably has a pitched roof, right? That probably makes sense there. Vermont is a very snowy place, so we need our roofs to be like that. Let the snow come off. Some more reasons to think that there are these kinds of redundant, easy inferences that introduce us to things like talk of numbers, properties, meanings, and so on, is that it makes it clear, it gives us the basis for a story about how these new noun terms, especially for abstracta here, right, can be introduced to language and can be learned. Right? You can teach a kid the word for dog or oak or river by pointing at these things, right? But you can't point at a universal. You can't point at a number, right? And so on. So how can we learn these terms if not by ostension and observation, right? Well, if there are these rules that entitle us to bridge from talk about a red barn to talk about the property of redness, or talk about two glasses to talk about the number 2, then we can see how it can be learned, right? And how numbers can be known. Of course, that's one of the main motivations for Hale and Wright's work on numbers. And actually, those of you who have, recently spent time with very young children may have noticed that maybe the vast majority of books for the preschool set are really designed to introduce kids to these language games, to be able to talk about the property of redness or the shape squareness or the number 2, right? On and on again, introducing them to these games in this way. Okay, so far, I've tried to at least give you some preliminary reasons to think that reference to things like properties and meanings arises via these kinds of redundant inferences. Again, there's plenty of objections to that. I've tried to handle them elsewhere. And I've also tried to suggest that this explains how we can come to learn the terms and know about the entities. I've also given you reasons to think that if that's what's going on, if terms for properties and meanings are introduced by redundant inferences, then the entities referred to can't be used to explain the truth of the original claim we started with. It's just a hypothesization. All right, at this stage you might say, okay, but hang on. If you're right, then our language is full of redundancies, right? Why would we want that? Why would we want to have property talk or meaning talk or number talk, right? If it just enables us to say things in these kinds of fancy, redundant terms. In fact, if you're a serious metaphysician, you might even say, you see, it would be stupid for language to be that redundant. So it must actually not be redundant. There must really secretly be some extra metaphysical criteria required for there to be a property of redness, rather than for there to just be a red barn. Right? So let's look at this question now. Why would we have or want a language with these built-in redundancies? I think there's actually an interesting answer here. And this is sort of where I've come since Ontology Made Easy. So in my 2015 book, Ontology Made Easy, I defend the idea that there are these easy inferences, but I never even raised the question why we'd want a language that had them. This is something I've happened on more recently. And the interesting answer I've found comes from the tradition of systemic functional linguistics. I don't know if anybody here has run across this before. If you have, I'd love to talk with you about it afterwards. It's been a tradition of work in linguistics that, as far as I know, has just not been cited in recent philosophical work at all, and I think it's super relevant. It's going to play, this is kind of like what I did over my pandemic, right? I read a bunch of this stuff in my study, because I was interested in these functional questions. I happened to get the books out right before the lockdown hit. It'll play a large role over these next 3 days. So let me just take a couple minutes now to introduce you a bit to this tradition, since I think it's not that familiar to most philosophers, and then we'll go back and see its relevance. So work in systemic functional linguistics originated from work in the Prague School of Linguistics in the 20s and 30s, which was led by Wilhelm Matthiesius. Roman Jakobson was also prominent in that. It was actually largely inspired by work in Husserl's logical investigations, especially investigations 3 and 4. And in fact, they had Husserl out to Prague in the 1930s, I forget what the date is, to give a talk to the Prague School of Linguistics, which unfortunately the transcript does not survive. But they were super interested in his work. So in the logical investigations, as some of you might remember, Husserl's concerned with a kind of systemic analysis of language in ways that hadn't been done before, when linguistics had focused largely on historical linguistics up to that time, including laws of compounding. What kinds of meaning can be sensibly compounded with others? This is work that was the sort of predecessor to Ryle's work on category mistakes. Huge influence on Ryle for that. I've got a paper on that if anybody's interested. So if you know about category mistakes, it comes out of there. In the logical investigations, Husserl also identifies what he calls laws of modification. That is, ways in which one meaning category can be transformed into another, as in cases of nominalization. For example, if you might say, she walked or she went for a walk, right? Then we've got a nominalization that makes use of a law of modification that entitles us to transform one meaning category to another. Or you might think about the barn is red to the barn has the property of redness, now transforming that adjective into a noun term, right? So that's already in Husserl. You might say Husserl put the systemic in systemic functional linguistics. The functional came later. The functional turn in it was inspired by the work of the anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, who insisted that we must study meaning by analyzing the functions of language within a culture, thinking of language as basically a human tool, right, that evolves for human cultural needs. And even today, systemic functional linguistics has been a huge influence in anthropology, though philosophers have mostly not noticed it or made use of it. Now, Malinowski, in turn, was a big influence on Wittgenstein, and some of you may have had the name Wittgenstein floating in your head since I started talking about functional pluralism at the beginning, right? Was also an influence on J.R. Firth. And Firth, well, English linguist, had the student Michael Halliday, who is really the one who is mostly responsible for developing systemic functional linguistics in its modern form. He worked first in the UK and then in Australia. And again, systemic functional linguistics has had a much bigger influence in Australia, and also I think in the Netherlands and other parts of Europe than it has in the US, where linguistics has really been dominated by work in the Chomskyan tradition. All right, so it's largely Halliday and some of his students and followers that I'll be citing here. All right, that's what the tradition is. Why should we care? Right? Why take interest in it? Okay, so I was interested in functional questions about language so that we could answer questions like why we want these redundant inferences, why we want property vocabulary. Also crucial for doing work in conceptual engineering, which I'll be talking about Friday, because I think the right way to evaluate proposals in conceptual engineering is according to how well the concepts or terms fulfill functions for us and what functions we want them to serve. That'll come up later. Systemic functional linguistics, not surprisingly, is built on the idea that the nature of language is closely related to the functions that it has to serve in human life. And so it aims to examine how the functions of language show up in the way language is organized as a system. So if you want to address functional questions about language, this is a great set of work to go to. They'll ask questions like what contributions different elements, say a modal system, a mood system, logical connectives, also abilities like the ability to cross grammatical categories, like I was just talking about, to nominalize terms that aren't nouns, for example, or to verbize terms that aren't verbs, we'll talk about. What difference this makes to what they call the meaning potentials of the system. And that is the sort of meaning-making resources that they offer speakers. Right? So let's move back to our redundancies. I'll give you some more broad overview on the systemic functional linguistics stuff and how to identify functions tomorrow. But right now I want to just use a bit of their results. Why would we want redundant inferences like this to be legitimate in a language? Well, many of the terms introduced by these redundant inferences are what the people in the systemic functional linguistics tradition call grammatical metaphors. And I'll tell you the truth, I don't love the terminology. Right? Here's why I don't love it. Right? If I say that terms for properties or numbers are grammatical metaphors, that will sound to many people like I'm being a fictionalist about these entities. It'll sound like I'm doing sort of early Yalblow, right? For those of you who know his work. And treating talk of properties or numbers as merely metaphorical. I don't mean any such thing by it, and neither do the folks in systemic functional linguistics. I'll stick by the terminology because that's what they use, but with that footnote of a reservation. If you look back to the original meaning of metaphor from the Greek metaphora, right, it doesn't have anything to do with being fictional, right? It just means literally a transfer or a carrying over. I think it was used for property rights in the Greek. Probably some of you know better than I do, right? So what goes on in a normal old semantic metaphor is you transfer one semantic category to another, right? That is one meaning to another. So if you have a shift in semantic meaning, you carry over the meaning of sharp when we talk about a knife being sharp, give it a new meaning if we talk about her speaking sharp words to her boss or whatever, right? Transfer of semantic meaning. What goes on in the case of grammatical metaphors, is a transfer instead in grammatical category, right? So, and these can go in various ways. I've talked about nominalization, so we can move from saying is red, the predicate, the barn is red, to using the noun term, the property of redness, right? You can also move from a noun to a verb, for example. You can move from talking about a knife, noun, to saying he knifed someone, right? And now I've transformed it into a verb. They can go in other ways too. You can move, they identify causal talk as grammatical metaphors. So if you say he lit the match so the gas exploded, you introduce a nominalization. When you say the lighting of the match, oh, there's one nominalization, right? Cause, or was the cause of the gas exploding, or the explosion of the gas. And now you've got several new noun terms introduced. So they can go across many different grammatical categories. Now, I'm no comparative linguist, but the folks in systemic functional linguistics have the expertise that I lack. And apparently this kind of ability to shift grammatical category is present across at least all the languages that they've studied. So this is not unique to English. You all can tell me later how Swedish and other languages you know work. There may be some differences in which ones are permitted, but these shifts are always permitted, and for good reason, as we'll see, because it's really, really useful. What's really interesting to us as philosophers, I think, is that maybe the vast majority of philosophically interesting and problematic, puzzling terms are grammatical metaphors, right? So terms for properties and meanings, we've been talking about numbers, processes, events, causes, time, possibilities, probabilities, necessities, thoughts, beliefs, minds, moral requirements. The list could go on and on. These are all grammatical metaphors. Could that lie behind some of their puzzling features? Let's find out. Okay, so here's the way it goes, right? According to the work in linguistics, if you're a really little kid, right, a new language learner, so for most kids, somewhere between like 1 and 3, right? You start out learning a kind of proto-language. You don't have a mastery of the grammar yet, but you can say stuff, right? They begin from what they call congruent meanings that are acquired in response to observations of the environment. Congruent meanings involve a noun term for an object, roughly in the sense, Spelke sense of object, a unified, medium-sized, trackable lump of stuff, right? They get the nouns. You use verb for a process or an event, an adjective for a property or an attribute, right? And so on. Those are the terms kids begin with. And they got documentation of this developmentally. So you might, if you're a 2-year-old, observe that scene and say, man, clean car, right? You got congruence all around. And these contribute to the child learning about the environment. But then grammatical metaphors are introduced a good bit later. And what happens there is a meaning that was originally construed by one kind of wording comes to be construed by another. So now, if you get sophisticated, right, then you could look at that and say, the man gave the car a good wash. Now you've introduced the noun term wash, right? And you can say things about the wash. It was a good wash, not a haphazard wash or something like that. You could say the car wash was a very messy enterprise. Say things about it. So I suggest that we begin our questions in a different place than traditional metaphysics and see where that leads us, right? Start a step back before you jump in and ask metaphysical questions like, are there meanings, properties, causes, times, kinds, whatever you're interested in? What are they? What's their essence or nature? Start by stepping back a bit and ask, what functions do these forms of language serve? And by what rules are they introduced into language? So why nominalize? And here we can go back to the linguists, right? Why is it so useful that it appears in every language, the capacity for grammatical metaphor anyway? Well, as they say, the primary motivation for nominalization is a functional one. By nominalizing, we're able to do things with the text that we can't do in unnominalized text. Okay? What sort of things? We've already seen it a little bit, right? So suppose we move from saying she bathed, congruent, to she took a bath. Then we're entitled to and enabled to say further things about the bath. She had or took a relaxing hot bath. Really hard to say without a noun term for bath. She bathed in hot water and found it very relaxing. Okay, not exactly the same and much wordier, right? We can put it in causal relationships. We can say it was her bath and not his shower that caused the flooding on the ground floor. Right? Again, it requires at least something a lot wordier and probably also less descriptive if you don't have the nominalization. Take they danced to they did a dance. Again, once we introduce the noun form here, they did a dance, then we can say things about it. We can go on to qualify it. We can say they did this well-known Romanian folk dance. If there's a way to say that without a noun for dance, I'm not sure what it is. Right? It would certainly be extremely wordy and probably not very descriptive. You could also not just qualify, but quantify the dances now. Right? How many dance doesn't even make grammatical sense. Right? But how many dances are in the second act? You're asking during intermission, and you might get the reply, the act after intermission includes 3 folk dances. And now you can count them. Right? Neat. So in short, with grammatical metaphors, we can qualify and quantify processes and events. We can also form text with greater lexical density, that is a higher proportion of content-carrying words, instead of like long drawn-out prepositional phrases and pronouns and so on. It also, the introduction of grammatical metaphors also enables us to organize our texts rhetorically, showing clearly the connections among ideas and putting the focus on different parts of information. So notice I just introduced one without even thinking about it. The introduction of grammatical metaphors enables us to, showing you the topic of that sentence. Right? The topic here is, what does it do to introduce grammatical metaphors? Thomas Hofweber already called some attention to that in his work on focus effects, if any of you remember his 2005 paper where he says, noun terms for numbers enable us to put the focus on bits of information to do with quantity. So if you say to me, Amy, you ate 5 bagels, you left none for the rest of us, and I might say in response, the number of bagels I ate is 2. Right, putting the focus on the quantity here, right? It also, this kind of rhetorical organization of sentences into longer texts, right, enables us to refer back to what we've established previously in the text to build a systematic system of explanation and knowledge, or knowledge. Also bureaucracy, as I'll come to in a minute. So the development of grammatical metaphors explodes with the development of science, technology, and bureaucracy. And the linguists have done this counting work of like how frequently they appear, right, in a way that I have not. They have, for example, examples pulled out of Newton's optics, showing the vast quantity of new nominalizations that are introduced by Newton in order to do that theorizing, right, that weren't there before. They also show how the great increase in the proportion of grammatical metaphors comes in various different languages and societies just when their technology and bureaucracy start to explode. In ancient China, in ancient Greece, in Sanskrit, right, and so on, which is pretty cool. So it seems to represent tendencies common to the elaborated discourse of science and technology, government and bureaucracy in all languages. Halliday says, it's no exaggeration to say that grammatical metaphor is at the foundation of all scientific thought. You cannot construct a scientific theory that is a design theory, as distinct from the evolved common sense theory, incorporating the grammar of everyday discourse, without exploiting the power of the grammar to create new virtual phenomena by using metaphoric strategies of this kind. They have another example they bring out is like, imagine a physics textbook that spends many chapters explaining how the particle's spin fluctuates randomly. And then you have to build on that knowledge and refer back to the random fluctuations of the particle's spin, right, in order to build on it. Here's an easier example, right? So even think about a bit of ecology, right? What you're looking for is a generalized explanation of why these kinds of things have tended to happen, right? And that requires being able to introduce new noun terms, right? So you might want to speak about the alterations in the migration patterns of trumpeter swans over the past century, and has among its causes the following, and then you list probably a bunch more grammatical metaphor noun terms, right? You can't even ask those kinds of questions without grammatical metaphors. You can say, this swan flew to Florida, right? But you can't answer these generalized scientific questions. Also interesting, is that grammatical metaphors play a huge role in building bureaucratic systems, sort of the other direction of fit, you might think, right? Not just an explanation, but in imposing norms, requirements, and entitlements. Again, look at legal discourse, or the sort of things that are on, like, you know, your mortgage, if you buy a house, and things like that. Tax code, certainly in my country, it's abstruse enough, right? And you'll find things like this. We have all these new noun terms. You don't just say Sally bought a house. You introduce talk of homeowners who are taxpayers and permanent residents, and we can speak of their tax and civic obligations and liabilities, right? Just grammatical metaphors all over the place. And again, you can sort of see why this has to be, even though it's kind of annoying. Because what you want is for these obligations, bureaucracies, to apply to everyone equally who has a certain status, right? Not just to Sally or Jane. Okay, so this gives us an idea then, an answer to our question, right? Why would we want a language with such redundancy? This redundancy is essential to introducing the kinds of grammatical metaphors that are essential to enabling us to do things like qualify and quantify events and processes, and also to build scientific theories and build bureaucracies. All pretty important activities to us, at least in this day and age, right? Now, so that should give the lie to the idea that, oh, well, it would be stupid for it to be redundant. There must be some extra metaphysical requirement. It's like, no, the language is useful, but for a different purpose. It's not there's a new requirement here. And if that's right, then we should just accept that these inferences are trivial, that there's nothing more it takes to have a bath than to bathe. Nothing more it takes for the barn to have the property of redness than for the barn to be red. Right? These inferences are perfectly valid and important to part of the way language works. But then we should also reject the idea that we should posit these entities only if they add explanatory power to our theories. They have other roles to play in language, including theoretic language, other than being posited explainers. So what you get out of this, as I put it in Ontology Made Easy, is a kind of simple realism that says, yes, there are properties, yes, there are events, yes, there are processes, but not a kind of explanatory realism that treats them as posits that are going to explain something. Now, some of this is familiar from other philosophical work, the idea that some of our terms, like number terms, can play other roles in explanation than being the posited explainers, than being like the mice in the pantry or the or Neptune or something. Steve Yablo has this neat argument that having noun terms for numbers enables us to finitely state some of the laws of physics in ways that would otherwise take an infinite series of infinitely long sentences. Not very convenient, but if you quantify over numbers, you can do it more efficiently. Alejandro Perez Caballo has this nice paper identifying a role of mathematical discourse in enabling us to systematize data in new ways that will bring to light explanatory features in the world, but they aren't the explainers. What they do is they bring to light certain kinds of patterns that enable us to form better explanations. Agustin Rayo has this nice work suggesting that logical truths enable us, again, not to identify new features of the world and to track the logical structure of the world, as Ted Sider would have it, but to use old information in new ways. Right? So there's some philosophical theories out in this ballpark. Nominalizations enable us, as we've seen, to demand and give generalized explanations. Right? So we might not have much time. You might even shrug at somebody who says, we want to explain what the red barn and the red house have in common. We've got to posit the property of redness for that, right? But there are some of these explanatory questions that we can't formulate without having property talk. It doesn't mean the properties are the explainers, right? So if you have thousands of patients, you might want to ask what the standard causes are of heart attacks, instead of just asking what stopped Jones's heart from beating, what stopped Smith's heart from beating, and so on, right? We may have no time for the question, what explains what the red barn and the red house have in common, but we have a lot of time for the question, what properties do all severe COVID-19 patients have in common, right? And you can't even formulate the question without property talk. There's all sorts of theories floated at the beginning, as some of you might remember, right? So people thought it was having the same blood type, having certain pre-existing conditions, being of a certain age, right? What is it? A really important scientific question. We need property talk to be able to ask it, though the properties aren't the explainers. Okay, so nominalizations are disanalogous to cases in which we posit entities like mice or planets to fuel a theory's explanatory success, right? They're not the explainers. But introducing the terminology does play crucial roles in enabling us to construct theories and bureaucracies, to ask certain explanatory questions, to demand general explanations, and to formulate unified explanations efficiently. Now you might say, okay, hang on, Amy, you're saying that, say, property talk plays an important role in explanations, but they're not like posited explainers that fuel the theory's explanatory success. What do you mean by that? Little sidebar on that. Just drawing on work by Catherine Hawley here has a nice way of putting it, building on some work by Stathis. Says, how do we distinguish what fuels the theory's explanatory success? She says, if a claim H is to be involved in generating a prediction in a way that entitles it to share in the confirmation which successful prediction brings, that helps fuel its success, H must satisfy two conditions. It must be that the theory minus H, subtracting H, the presupposition of H, can't generate the prediction alone. And it must be the case that there's no available sensible alternative to H, which could have done the work just as well. However, as I argue elsewhere, purely ontological claims about the existence of numbers, meanings, properties, sorts of things we're talking about here, can be subtracted out from the relevant predictive theories without altering the assertive content of the theories. How do we understand subtraction out? Here you can build on Steve Jablow's work. He has this nice stuff about subtraction. That is, what you can take away in the way of a presupposition, while the analytic implications that would tell you if the theory is confirmed or not remain all the same, right? So here's Steve's example. I think I have next. These are what he calls fail-safe propositions, as you can remove. So take a claim like the number of planets is 8, right? This seems to be referring to a number, but Jablow says, look, if it has this presupposition that there are numbers, that's a fail-safe presupposition. Because, as he puts it, I would not say this is not my own voice, it could turn out that there are no numbers, and yet the assertive content that there are 8 planets remains. And you can still confirm or disconfirm the theory in the same way, right? So the posit, as he puts it, again, not my words, of the existence of numbers is not fueling the success of the theory. Contrast with the planet Neptune causes the observed variations in Uranus's orbit, presupposes there is a planet Neptune. Subtract that presupposition. What's left of the assertive content? It's hard to know how to even make any sense of it, right? So in that case, the assertive content does not remain when we subtract the presupposition of the existence of the planet Neptune. So as I argue, sort of building on and also criticizing in some ways some of Jablow's work on this, purely ontological claims typically don't fuel a theory's explanatory success, but they can play other roles, right? Reference to numbers, reference to properties, can figure in explanations in helpful ways. Okay, so what we've got out of this so far is the idea that, and I'm starting to get the functional pluralism idea on the board, terms enter language by different routes. Some are observationally, some by trivial inferences from more basic forms of speech, right, from congruent speech. Observationally introduced terms, right, like we get from congruent terms, serve to co-vary with features of the environment, enable us to track, communicate about, and investigate environmental conditions. Terms like dog, oak tree, river. Then we can also discuss theoretically introduced terms. For theoretic entities not yet observed, serve to refer to posits that would fuel an explanation of observations. And maybe or maybe not we'll get to observe them one day. But then we can also separate from these, I don't mean this to be exhaustive, grammatical metaphors that are introduced by redundant inferences and that tend to play other roles, for example, in enabling us to demand and give generalized explanations, to express laws in finite form, to systematize data, and so on. Okay, so we've got different functions, different rules of entry, right? So if that's all right, then I think with easy ontology, we get a kind of vindication here. We should accept that there are these trivial inferences. We should conclude that there are properties, meanings, and numbers in the only sense that has sense given the rules of use for the terms. And we can add something new, a nice functional story about what functions are served in having a language that's capable of introducing new terms by these kinds of redundant inferences. So there's a sense in which I will take over some of the alternative functional explanations of a fictionalist like early Yablo, right? But I'll differ from them on the conclusion, right? So noting alternative functions for me is not at odds with saying, yeah, there are numbers, properties, propositions, whatever, right? So that's what I have in common and what I differ from the fictionalists. So now I think we have the basis for seeing where the explanatory power criterion goes wrong. Maybe properties, meanings, and numbers don't add explanatory power. They certainly don't seem to fuel our explanations, our causal explanations, in the way that mice, planets, or microbes do. But that's no mark against them if these terms are introduced by different roots to serve different functions. We should reject the explanatory power criterion for saying there are such things, not the entities. If the vocabulary is useful, and I've tried to give you a reason to think it is, we should take it on, right? And then we've often got easy arguments that of course there are properties, numbers, propositions, whatever, even if they're not posited explainers. All right, let's step back to look at whether we can get a holistic version of an explanatory power criterion instead. You might think it's got more promise, right? Because you might think, well, still, you've got reference to terms like numbers and properties, or things like them, appearing in your best scientific theories. If we have to quantify over them in order to render the statements of our best scientific theory true, we should accept them. So, okay, right? And yet, that might do for getting, properties and numbers into the fold, as it were, though I think it's still overlooking some crucial distinctions between our talk about properties and our talk about, say, dogs, planets, and microbes. But even there, if you do that, there's a whole lot of other everyday and philosophically interesting and important purported entities, right? That reference to them just isn't likely to occur in our scientific theories at all. We shouldn't expect it, right? Take things like works of art, aesthetic properties, moral requirements, maybe even things like, well, I guess you have some reference to possibilities, but to metaphysical necessities, things like that. Should we take that as a knock against them? Well, again, I think that looks acceptable only if we have our blinders on. So I think Quine was really only interested in scientific discourse. That's cool. Scientific discourse is super important. It's not all we ever do, and it's not all we care about or should care about in philosophy and in metaphysics, right? We're not always explaining or theorizing. We do a lot of other things. Sometimes we are regulating behavior of ourselves or our kids or our students or the whole country, whatever. Sometimes we're conveying rules of use for our terms, instructing and reasoning, expressing our attitudes, establishing social relations, greeting and parting, and all sorts of other things, right? So take the case of moral properties. Maybe no scientific explanatory theory is ever going to make reference to moral properties. Does that give us reason to deny that there are moral properties if we're never going to quantify over them in our best scientific theory? I don't think so, right? Suppose reference to things being good or bad plays a function in regulating our behavior, in solving coordination problems among humans, whatever. Give your favorite theory, right? To say if they don't add explanatory power to our best scientific theories, we should deny that there are such things, is just a non sequitur. They weren't supposed to do that. Moral language has many other functions, probably predominantly things like regulating behavior or expression of attitudes, or again, choose your favorite. It was never supposed to serve in a quasi-scientific explanation or as part of a scientific explanatory theory. Okay, so, and what I said for moral properties there, a reference to them, goes for a huge range of other properties, entities, philosophically relevant entities, aesthetic entities, modal entities, and so on. So what do we get out of this? So here's the consequences that I would draw for metaphysics. We should reject explanatory power, contribution of explanatory power, as a criterion for saying that there are certain things, both in the local form and in the holistic form, at least as an across-the-board criterion. Right? Now, if you think you're positing a new planet, and that doesn't explain anything, then you're in some trouble, right? Or a new kind of microbe, right? But it shouldn't be accepted as an across-the-board criterion because not everything we talk about using, say, noun language is intended to posit something to fuel our explanations. Nouns do many things. And we should give up the explanatory conception of metaphysics and not just assume that all metaphysical theories are like scientific theories, have the same kinds of goals, right? Maybe we should even give up the kind of language that constantly suggests this. Language that was really only introduced, as far as I know, in the 50s, and talk about metaphysical theories and their posits and things like that, right? That lends itself to this kind of interpretation of metaphysics. The underlying trouble, you might say, is that metaphysics has traditionally been concerned with all kinds of topics. What is art? Are there moral properties? What is modality? As well as things like, are there properties? Are there numbers? Are there ordinary composite objects? And so on. All kinds of topics that appear in all kinds of discourse in our lives. Sometimes contribution of explanatory power might be relevant, right? But subjecting all areas of discourse, from the chemical to the aesthetic, to the same standards for scientific theories is a mistake. It's rather like evaluating all artifacts, from knives to hair dryers to salad bowls, according to how well they cut steak. Right? It's just not going to be a relevant criterion in all cases, because terms serve many other functions, both within science, when they contribute to our formulation of explanatory theories, without fueling their explanatory success, and beyond science, in our moral discourse, in our aesthetic discourse, in our social lives. So the local explanatory conception of metaphysics, I've argued, relies, now we can see this is a diagnosis, right, on presupposing that the noun terms at issue in metaphysical debates serve an explanatory function. And that's why it's relevant to reject them if they fail. The holistic explanatory conception only has in view explanatory theoretic discourse. Right? But metaphysics has been, and I think should be, concerned with much more in human life and in human discourse. So this is all an argument for beginning a step back. And before we ask traditional metaphysical questions, begin by asking functional linguistic questions. What functions do the terms serve? How do they work? By what rules are they introduced? And then eventually we can turn to ask those questions I'll come to on Friday. Should we keep this terminology, or should we revise it? Should we replace it? What should we do with it? And all of this relies on and gives you an initial argument for this sort of repeated theme of these lectures, that we need to take seriously the idea that language may serve many functions. In this case, not just to posit things to fuel our explanations, but also to enable us to ask explanatory questions, to regulate behavior, and so on. Now, this might leave you with a great many more questions. Okay, you might say, but what do you mean by function, Thomasson? Right? How can you identify these different linguistic functions, right? And what difference will this make to our philosophical work, right? For that, tune in tomorrow. That's it.
All right, thank you very much indeed. And we have time for some questions. And you need to speak into the microphone in order for your question to be recorded. So please do speak into your microphone. We'll start with Vladek here.
Thank you, Amie. It was very interesting. There's one thing I'd like to ask you. It's about this idea of an easy inference, right? So I would say that inference is easy and it's just a matter of redundancy. If you can say everything that you say with the, let's say, with the nominalization, without that. But if there are certain things that you cannot say in the original language without this metaphor, right? Yes. Mm-hmm. Then maybe it's more than a metaphor. It's kind of it opens up things that make possible claims that you couldn't claim in the original language. But then it's not an easy inference. It's a kind of commitment, ontological commitment of some sort. And it would seem that in many cases this is really the case, that when we move to the property talk or the talk about truth, right, then we can say things that really cannot be said in the language without it, right? So it's not an easy inference in this sense, right? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, okay, so I think it is an easy inference, but it does bring ontological commitment, right? So maybe we're just differing in what we mean by an easy inference. So I want to agree wholeheartedly with what you say. That is, in many cases, part of what we get out of introducing these new noun terms is an addition of expressive power to the language. So now we can say things and sometimes make inferences, make distinctions we couldn't make before, right? I mean, David Lewis does this beautifully with respect to possible worlds talk in the opening chapter, I think it is, of On the Plurality of Worlds, right? And say the ways in which we can distinguish philosophical theses by appeal to possible worlds talk that we couldn't otherwise, right? And you might be able to do similar things with, I think it's well known for number talk too, using noun terms for numbers and so on. So often these do add to the expressive power of the language, and that's another facet of what makes them so useful, right? That now we still, I think, can get, so what you often get is a kind of one-way street up to number talk, but it doesn't mean everything that you can say now using noun terms for numbers can be translated back down to this sort of untransformed original discourse, right? So I think that we should say, yeah, there are numbers. In many senses of reduction, they can't be reduced to anything more basic. Similarly for possible worlds, right? And I'm happy to say we should be ontologically committed to such things as long as you preserve that line of talk. We should say there are, in the only sense that has sense, numbers, possible worlds, properties, all that. Allow that discourse can't always be translated back down. But that's still, in my view, a really different matter than the kind of view of ontological commitment you get out of a lot of the Neo-Quinians and even of Lewis, right? So to say we could introduce possible worlds talk, and here's why it's really theoretically useful and enables us to distinguish options that weren't distinguishable before, versus thinking of it, as many of Lewis's followers do, and Lewis kind of encourages, right, as if it's sort of tracking these strange things out there disconnected from our spatiotemporal universe, and of which we can ask, are there really possible worlds? Because then there really doesn't even make sense anymore. It's like, yeah, there are possible worlds in the only sense that has sense, a sense in which we become entitled to refer to possible worlds by grammatical transformations up from talk about what could be originally and then what is possible. So we should say there are possible worlds, but you're quite right that I should probably bring that in explicitly. The idea that often it adds a sort of expressive power to the language too that can't be translated back down. I don't think it has to have the easier inference count. Sometimes it just makes it shorter, right? But sometimes you don't have that ability to unpack it. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's move on to Ingvar Johansson.
Thank you for the very nice lecture. First, I agree with very much of what you say, but not all. And as a philosopher, I will focus on where I disagree. Also, I should say from the start that I'm quite familiar with all your writings from fiction and metaphysics and onwards. I'm not speaking only because having listened to you for 45 minutes. Now, first a comment, and that I will turn into a question about your own development as a philosopher. Now, the comment is, I would like to introduce a conception I've been doing, what I call ontology, that falls outside your slots, and I would like to call it the classificatory conception of ontology. And that goes well with all you said about the explanatory conception, and I agree. But if you look at what you take to be a trivial inference, the house is red. There is a property of redness. Now, what is the relationship between red and property? Property is a more abstract word. It belongs into a classificatory scheme. And in my view, part of ontology is to give us a very abstract classification. Every kid starts with learning about different kinds of birds, they distinguish them from fishes, suddenly we'll learn up to animals, and they are distinct from plants and so on. And I think we can move upwards toward what Aristotle would call the highest genera. Yeah. And that, I think, is something one can do. Well, I can relate it to what Wahlberg said about expressive power. The term property has an expressive power of its own because it's more abstract than read. But when we have learned both concepts, of course, the inference looks trivial. But when you're a kid, it's not trivial at all. Yeah, that's my view. So I can't agree with all of it. Now, a question about your philosophical development. I think that is a change, but so you may find something in some other philosopher who the philosopher himself or herself does not see there. So I'm a bit a little unsure about it. I'm quite happy that you are this year's Pufendorf lecturer. Yeah. In methods and metaphysics, fiction and metaphysics, yeah, as I have read it, you make a basic threefold abstract classification between A, spatio-temporal particulars, B, mental states with intentionality, 3, ontological dependence. And most of the things you say, I agree with, and I find it very good and nice and everything. It's nice to agree. But now, if I look at your later books, this threefold classification is gone. You never speak about of intentionality. You never speak about ontological dependence. So to me, it seems as if, a bit sadly, Amie Thomasson has gone through a kind of deflationist turn in her philosophy. Have you or have you not?
Haha. Okay, good question. Good. Before did I hear right? Are you Ingvar Johansson?
Yeah.
I'm so glad to meet you. Yeah, I've loved your work since I was a graduate student. So delighted to.
You refer to my ontology.
I sure do. Yeah, back in fiction and metaphysics, and probably elsewhere. Very cool. Very glad to meet you. Let me. I guess I'll answer the questions in order. Or try to. Yeah. Okay. So. Classificatory ontology. If I'm understanding correctly what you mean by that, and knowing some of your work, I've got at least a help on that, that is an approach to ontology I want to leave open. As I hope come out, maybe I can even add a reference to it on Friday, right? Depending on how you understand it, roughly, right? So I do think that there are important differences, for example, between, and I'll probably just express it slightly differently now, terms for abstracta and terms for concreta, right? Which we can then state in the object language, if you like, as differences between abstract objects and concrete objects. What I'd want to do, and I used to do some work on categories and stuff like that too, is to try to find a way of understanding these category differences. Not in terms of, obviously you can't put in terms of differences we can observe between spatiotemporal entities and abstracta, because we don't observe the abstracta at all, right? But roughly to try to show how we can recreate some of these in terms of differences in the entry rules and rules of use for the terms in question, which I alluded to a bit of today, right? For concreta, we introduce the terms typically by ostension, by having a kind of causal relationship to the things. That's not all that's involved, I don't think, but that's...
Wait. We need to move on, Ingvar. Can we perhaps come back to it? Yeah.
Okay, can I get a quick shot at the second question?
Sure.
So anyway, that would be the hope, right? And done in that way, I think it can be epistemologically clear and helpful and part of the sort of tradition of a kind of conceptual approach to ontology that I would certainly leave room for. We can talk about that on Friday too, because that'll come in. On the second part, have I taken a deflationary turn? And what happened to the reference to spatiotemporal things, mental things, and ontological dependence? So, in a sense, I mean, I certainly count myself as a deflationist. In a sense, I think I always was. So I think that the approach I was taking to fictional characters way back in the day, right? And this came out maybe most clearly in the follow-up article on fictional characters and literary practices, right? Is kind of built around this idea, what the hell more do you think it would take for there to be fictional characters than for there to be people with certain kinds of intentions who write stories in a certain tradition, pretending to refer, and so on. That's roughly a kind of easy ontological approach to fictional characters in my later sense of easy ontology. But remember, for me, deflationism doesn't mean saying these are like lightweight, not really existing. It means saying they exist in the only sense that these terms have, the only sense that has sense. I would still have room, in my view, for notions of ontological dependence. Somehow the literature is taken off and everybody goes grounding these days instead, which I think introduces some new obscurities, but it's on the same track. Now, how do we understand that? I have some epistemological worries about how the grounding people understand it. But ontological dependence, as I care about it, and as I think you see articulated in the Husserlian tradition, can really be understood in terms of conceptual interrelations. And as long as it's understood in terms of these conceptual interrelations, I'm on board with it. And I can think of what I'm doing in saying a fictional character depends on the intentional states of an author, maybe the existence of some copy of the text, and so on, as laying out conceptual interrelations between the very idea of a fictional character, what the application conditions are for it, right, and the idea of intentionality, texts, and so on. So all that kind of early work I would sort of bring into the fold, or most of it, maybe there's a few things I would alter, as a way of taking a kind of roughly conceptual analysis approach to saying what would it take for there to be the relevant things, laying out the dependence. It may work on artifacts similarly, works of art, right? And then in most cases it's fairly straightforward to say those conditions are met, so of course there are works of art fictional characters. So I didn't have it all worked out in my mind when I wrote Fiction and Metaphysics, but I think I was saying this to my companions at lunch, you can see what I've been doing over the years as kind of taking successive steps back. Not really changing tracks, but thinking about the methodology I used in Fiction and Metaphysics and what can justify that and how does it differ from what a lot of people I got to know as metaphysics colleagues, people like Ted Sider, Laurie Paul, how it differs from what they were up to. But I hope it preserves a lot of that kind of early tradition I was brought up on, the sort of Husserl, Brentano to some extent, ordinary language tradition of work on ontology.
All right, we have several questions, so let's move on to Tobias Hansen Wahlberg.
So thank you, Amie. It was very interesting, the first lecture. I have a quite brief question. So I wasn't clear about how strong your argument was supposed to be. So are you rejecting all metaphysics as being explanatory? Do you reject that any metaphysics is explanatory? So all those kinds of movements or counts are somehow empty or meaningless?
So,
and have a follow-up on that.
Okay, so let me put it in these terms, right? I don't reject that for some existence questions, an explanatory criterion could be relevant. It all depends roughly on what the term was supposed to do, right? So, if you want to posit like, what was that? Sorry, there was a 12-year-old girl who published a paper on the, what is it, like especially some sort of aura that you could feel, have a healing touch, right? So the healing touch, right, had better have some real effects in the world. If you could show that it doesn't, that doesn't explain anything, that someone passed their hands over the patient, we should eliminate the healing touch or the ghosts or whatever, right, or the witches. So some cases it is relevant, other cases it isn't. Now these I think are typically empirical scientific existence questions, not the sort of thing that gets debated these days anyway by metaphysicians who tend to focus more on questions about do numbers, properties, composite material objects instead of just things arranged that way. Those kinds of debates, that's typically not what's at stake between them.
Yeah, so I was thinking about just the classical Greeks, For example, they were thinking of macroscopic objects and trying to explain change, and they postulated, for example, Democritus postulated atoms, which you couldn't test empirically at those times. But he would say that, or we could read him as saying that postulating atoms would explain the phenomena, although you couldn't test it empirically, at least not at those times. So, and he wasn't making easy inferences, he's trying to explain things metaphysically.
Yeah.
So what was he up to?
Yeah, I mean, back in those days, of course, there wasn't yet a clear division between philosophy and the sciences, or between metaphysics and the sciences. So I'm no scholar of ancient Greek philosophy, but I would be inclined to read him as actually making something like an empirical existence claim, an explanatory claim that would be relevant, and then whether these could eventually explain something, right? That would be relevant for the existence of atoms. If I'm understanding it right, I might be reading my conception of atoms into his here. But to that kind of existence question, it can be relevant. Yeah, so what I really want to reject is it as an across-the-board condition that also applies to all these standard metaphysical debates where it gets used.
Right, so who is next? I think there was someone over here. Okay.
Hi, Amie. Thanks for that very interesting talk. And all of this is, as you know, maybe very... Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is all very much up my alley, of course. And one question that's that I find kind of difficult when trying to develop these ideas is the following. So if there are numbers and properties and the like, as you admit, is it also a function, not the function, but a function at least, of the word property to refer to properties?
Yeah, depends what you mean by reference. But if you mean something fairly innocuous by it, then sure. Some people tend to mean by it something more like, you know, picking out in a kind of tracking way that involves a kind of causal connection, right? Being a sort of e-representation in Hugh Price's sense. And then I would say no. So if you mean refer in a lightweight way that we can say, yeah, this is the semantic value of the term property or something like that, we can talk about. And if we're doing a semantic theory, we might be able to say, here are the things referred to. That's harmless, and I'd be happy with that. I mean, I don't think that's the original reason it's introduced, but you can say that in a kind of deflationary way. But I think we need to get away from, and a lot of the discourse in metaphysics, of course, is done without distinguishing these senses of refer, right? Like Hofweber is always like, oh yeah, so the function of mathematical discourse isn't to refer to these things, right? So I think a lot of it hinges on a kind of use of reference that's much more heavyweight, that involves a kind of, something like a kind of tracking relationship that we have reason to think is not what's going on in property discourse, in number discourse, and so on. Right. Does that answer your question?
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess it's easy for an easy ontologist just to say that, you know, property refers to properties, but to say that it's the function of the word, that seems to make it more tricky somehow.
Yeah, maybe I should deny that it's the function. I mean, we have a different reason for introducing this, and the reference kind of falls out of the need to have this kind of generalizing term, right? And we certainly want to distinguish the way in which this vocabulary gets introduced, right, which doesn't require that there's these properties C, and we're referring to them in the way that dog vocabulary is introduced. There's these canines C, and we're introducing this word to refer to them. So we do want to respect that kind of bifurcation, so to speak, in the rules by which they're introduced and in the reasons we have these in our vocabulary. So I think, you know, mostly when that is said, right, I'm sure isn't the sense that you would say it, but like Herman Capellan says, the function of salmon is to refer to the salmon, right? And the function of freedom is to refer to the freedom, and that's all we can say, right? I think that's, at the very least, very unhelpful, and that the real reason we have this kind of vocabulary is something very different than it's trying to pick out some entities for the freedom and properties. Salmon, maybe. Yeah.
All right, so.
Thanks. So this is not a specialist question at all, and I apologize if you answer these questions already in your works. But so it's just a train of thought that was triggered by a reference to Jakobsen, and so he's worked on many things, and one of the things that I worked on a long time ago was his criticisms of Saussure's idea of the arbitrariness of the linguistic sign, and he has done very interesting stuff on how, in many cases, the linguistic sign is not arbitrary, and language is driven by also people's desire to mirror the signifier, the reality in some sense. So, does this apply, or would this be problematic, perhaps, for some of the claims you've made today, in the sense that maybe what's going on is not internal to language and transformations of the linguistic sign, but that we use these concepts and terms, metaphysical concepts and terms, because we want to represent or mirror reality in some sense, or I don't even know whether this is an objection or a friendly comment, to be honest, but I just wanted to explore this a little bit, if you think it's interesting.
It's super interesting, and I wish I knew Jakobson better so that I could speak more clearly and confidently to this. I haven't read much Jakobson, and not in a long time, so that's a little bit out of my realm of knowledge. I'd love to talk with you more about it and see what you know. I mean, certainly in the contemporary literature, I'd say one of the inspirations for my work, and a connection to what you were saying at the end, is the idea that there's often this mistake made of thinking of language as a mirror of reality, right? And that's something that Hugh Price brings to light, and that's part of what sort of tunes me into the sort of neo-pragmatist approach to some of these issues. So it's thinking of language as if it is or should be a mirror of reality that often leads people to take these sort of metaphysical debates about are there really numbers or properties and so on seriously, in a way that I think is mistaken if we understand the full functions of this kind of language. But I'm sorry, I can't really speak to the relationship to Jakobson, but maybe we can talk about it later. You can tell me more about what you know, because that's something I'd like to track back again. It's been a long time. Yeah.
All right, Robin Stenvall.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was wondering regarding the notion of normative virtue that you raised. I mean, dispositionalists, for example, would argue that this kind of explanations, they are really explanatory, because you should keep separate a description of a property and the property itself. So what you're doing there is really just sort of describing the property without mentioning the property itself. But still it is explanatory, they would argue. So dispositions, for example, are explanatory entities.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have anything to say about that, because it seems to me that it must be quite of some importance for you to answer.
Yeah. So I don't think appeal to dispositions as an ontological category, right, is itself explanatory. I do think this is normative virtue. I know people will disagree with me on this. I think the intuition that it does. So, okay, so we say, why might this break if I dropped it, right? Because it has this sort of disposition of fragility, right? That, I think, as we say it, is really just saying, your license to infer it'll break if I drop it, roughly. It could also be a placeholder for a more proper explanation. Now, suppose I'm a chemist or something like that, right? Then I might be able to go investigate, right? What's the lattice structure of the bonds among these components that's going to explain why it breaks so easily? And that might be a legit, real explanation, right? I also don't say that, and I was a little cautious about this in ways that I didn't really highlight in the talk. So I don't necessarily think that the things that we acquire reference to by nominalization can never serve as explanations. They just can't explain that original fact that we hypothesize out of. That would be a normative virtue explanation. So it may be, for example, that we can, gosh, I don't know enough physical science for this, but that we could then put explanations of the relationship between the disposition of fragility and the disposition to melt. Maybe there's some important connections between those. And that could be a real explanation, right? It could be a real explanation of the relationship between having had a pre-existing condition and suffering really badly from COVID-19, right? Even though these are properties. So I don't mean to say that properties can never figure in real explanations or dispositions, but the sort of hypostatization out to them, right, as a kind of entity here, can't itself explain the original fact that we hypostatized from. So maybe that, I hope that kind of scratches some of the itch that my friends who love dispositions have, and I certainly don't want to outlaw talk of dispositions. I think that this can't play any role, though I think that treating the initial reference to the disposition of fragility is not going to explain why it's fragile. That's just a word game, essentially, a useful word game.
Okay, cheers, thanks.
All right. See, we have.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I'm quite sympathetic to most of your conclusions. I'm just
you.
very curious. You keep speaking of existing in the only sense we can make of that word.
Yeah.
And I'm very curious about what that sense is on your view, or what function does existence claims have on your view?
Oh, it's two different questions, I think. So the closest that I talk about this is in, I think it's chapter 2 of Ontology Made Easy. Okay. So I think that, if you like, existence claims, it's going to be rough, but what function do they play? I'm not really talking that much in functional terms yet at that stage in my work, but here's roughly the idea, that they roughly, it's kind of a Fregean idea, right? That they serve to, in a way, I mean, what we use mostly in normal life is non-existence claims more than existence claims, right? Serve to roughly impugn the use of a term as ill-grounded, very roughly, right? So if I say unicorns don't exist, I might, to my little daughter, I might be informing her that really this term derives from stories and pictures, not from creatures in a forest, right? Santa Claus doesn't exist, same thing, right? I think that there's general rules of use for existence claims, such that are sort of unified, right? At least for many terms, is what I say in Ontology Made Easy. If the application conditions for a certain term, like table or unicorn or tree or whatever, are fulfilled, then we can say there are tables, trees, unicorns. And we could also then, just adopting the standard Quinean equivalence there, say that these things exist. I don't draw any distinction between there are and there exist. Now, there are other cases where talk about numbers, talk about properties, talk about application conditions isn't quite so relevant and helpful. It's more like talk about the introduction rules, right? Which is not exactly, because in some ways, like for number talk, there are no worldly empirical conditions that are required for the term, the number 2, to apply. Now we can trace that back to the introduction rules for number talk, right? So from the claim there are 2 glasses on the table, we can infer the number of glasses on the table is 2, and so there's a number 2. But of course, that claim there's a number 2 is also fine if the original claim is false, if there are actually 3 glasses on the table or none and I was suffering from some kind of illusion. So that's a sense in which we can say, in some way there are no like worldly application conditions for number talk, but there are inference rules that will entitle us at the end of them to say there are numbers, or there is a number 2. Now, I'm roughly an inferentialist about meaning, so I think that the sense given to P's exist, right, is roughly that the relevant rules for introducing P talk are fulfilled. And these will vary depending on what category of term you might say, or even what term particularly P is. So the introduction rules for unicorn talk or cow talk are really different than the introduction rules for number talk or property talk, right? But it's only given those rules for the term P that we can give sense to the question, do P's exist, right? Given those rules, then, we can start to answer questions like, are there properties? We could say, well, look, here's the rules. The barn's red, right? So the barn has the property of redness, right? So there's a property. That's what property means. That's all it takes for there to be a property. So properties exist in the only sense that has sense. And then we kind of, this is a standard move of mine, put pressure on the metaphysician who thinks, no, that's not enough, to say, okay, what more do you really think it takes? And can make any sense of those alleged requirements, or can we diffuse them as based on some kind of misunderstanding, right? And similarly for possible worlds, too, right? Similarly for cows, right? So the only sense that has sense for me is the sense that's given roughly by the rules of use for the term, especially the introduction rules. These will vary by the kind of term, but I think once we lay those on the table, we can see pretty clearly that the right answer is, yep, properties, numbers, fictional characters, etc. do exist. There are such things. Unicorns don't. Does that answer your question?
All right, we have time for one short question, if possible.
Yeah, very short then. I'm interested in what theologians say about souls, intermediate state, life after death, eternal life. Let's stick to soul. What do you think? How would you, as a metaphysician, approach the epistemological question? Is there anything to know? And in that case, what? How would you approach it?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, how would I approach it? I would have to start by asking, what do you mean by soul? Yeah. And what do you think it would take for there to be souls, right? So if you are sort of, I don't know, what Vermont people would call new agey, right? And you think all it really takes to have a soul is to have a certain kind of way of being that makes me characteristically me and different from other people and so on, then in that sense, you could say there are souls, or boy, my soul was hurt by the isolation time in the pandemic, or whatever, meaning that my whole way of being has changed. That could be true. If you're a traditional religious person, maybe you think it takes something different, right? For there to be a God that puts some sort of invisible spirit inside of you, maybe some sort of spirit that's going to survive after you die, right? And that's a very different set of application conditions, right? Then we have to ask, are those conditions fulfilled? How would we know? How could we tell? Is it the sort of thing there could be empirical evidence for, right? Sometimes people have tried to take evidence. They used to try to like weigh people before and after they died, right? Didn't they? To see if something disappeared, right? So some people have thought at some times that there was a possibility of empirical evidence for or against, and so they must have thought of it as an empirical claim. So there's many conceptions of soul. There's probably a lot that I'm leaving out from other traditions, maybe from other religious traditions and so on. But I'd have to start by figuring out what someone thinks, yeah, what do you mean? What do you think it would take for there to be a soul? And only then can you start to sort out roughly whether these entry rules or application conditions are satisfied.
All right, we need to end here, so we thank the speaker, Professor Thomasson, again.
Thank you very much indeed.